It's interesting. I said it.
Oh, you said you're trying to wean yourself off.
Yes, I've been trying very hard to this episode to not say it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's what I say far too much on Station 13.
Oh, that's very interesting. Should we start with follow-up?
Okay. I wanted to address a comment that I didn't get time to properly respond to on Reddit.
Oh, yeah.
From one of our friends of the show who has an excellent Reddit username, which is no tamanegi, which means tamanegi is onion. So he has no onions.
No onions.
But he is a drummer. And he's saying that he's in the same camp as I in that he can remember, I assume he, maybe she, they can remember a time when it was physically impossible to do any kind of vocalizing while playing music. The same with me, it either had to be rhythm or moving the mouth and operating the vocal cords, and
Right.
never the two shall meet. When one was doing, the other one was just all chaotic. And so this he/she basically went back to the woodshed and bit by bit practiced up the ability to do both at once, and finally got over it. But it was one interesting thing that No Tamanegi says is that, I'll just read off the comment on Reddit. It also brought with it the tangible sense that I was actively carving new neural pathways in my brain, that I was linking two neural centers that weren't used to communicating with each other. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? Like, you could actually have that feeling that...
Yeah, that tangible sense. Because often you learn a new thing and it takes so long
Right.
that you don't quite know when you cross the threshold from not being able to do it to being able to do it.
Right.
But there are some things when you practice so intensely, you can almost feel, exactly as they say, new neural pathways being sort of formed in your mind.
So I guess there's hope for me yet. Or maybe not.
You've just got to sit down and do it intensely. I think last time we talked about it as well, I brought up I thought it was very difficult for drummers. I've met drummers who can do it before as well. And it is like absolute magic. It's amazing.
Yeah. And pretty much all... I mean, there are quite a few excellent bass players who sing as well. Like there's Oteil Burbridge, and there's... Richard Bonner, and there is obviously Sting,
Right.
And I mean, the list goes on. So it's definitely possible. You kind of, I guess, seeing people do it so comfortably like that, you sort of think that there must be something wrong with me that I can't do it. However, these comments from No Tamanegi gives me hope that I can't do it now, but who's to know that, say, Sting, for example, also didn't begin with a similar problem and just basically had to go back to the basics, playing scales and reading something, or,
Right. I mean, I think it's, every pianist struggles at first with doing the left and right hand at the same time, right?
Right, yeah, that's right. It is amazing the way that musicians can divide their brains up into those different components that are operating seemingly independently, because drummers obviously do it with their four limbs. And when you first sit down at a drum kit, when you're just sort of playing around, I can play drums, anybody can play drums, and you realize, well, my arms can do it, but my legs aren't doing, or everything's operating at the same time, and I can't get my legs to do something different. And then, of course, you see, professional drummers or highly experienced drummers, and they're amazing. Like, all four limbs can just sort of operate completely independently. And another amazing example is my father, who is a classical pipe organist. And
pipe organs have got so many pedals and knobs and keys and...
Right. Right. So, basically he's reading music that has three staves. So treble, bass, and then pedal. And he's operating pedals with his feet, with both feet, and two hands, obviously, but often there'll be multiple... They call them manuals for pipe organs, but those are the keyboards that you see in front of a pipe organist. And there'll be 2, 3, 4, maybe sometimes even for very, very large organs there'll be 5, but I assume most of them are around 2 to 4. So you have different stops on the organ are assigned to different manuals, giving you different sounds on each keyboard. And so that way you may have one hand up here and the other one down here, and then you have your legs doing something else. So you've got to be thinking about left hand, right hand, which keyboard you're playing, and your legs, your left leg playing down there, your right leg taking over when the notes go up there, and reading...
Do the pedals usually play like a single sort of backing note, like the main
No.
note of that? Or do you play chords with them? Maximum of 2 notes per chord, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, you will hear fifths and octaves, but because they're so low, the notes are so low in pitch, it doesn't really make sense to be doing intervals other than basic fifths and octaves.
Right.
But the really virtuosic organ music, the German and French virtuosic organ music, has very, very complicated pedal parts as well that work completely independently to your left hand. So it is basically 3 parts operating at the same time by 4 limbs.
Oh, right. That's cool. Actually, I'm suddenly realizing that I have loads of questions about the organ that I've never thought to ask. But those 2 to 4, maybe 5 keyboards,
Yeah.
do they cover the same range of notes? Are they just a different sort of timbre using different pipes or something, but covering essentially the same range? Do they cover 88 keys? Like, what is the story there?
No, there's not 88 keys. There's less. Depends on the organ, depends on the country, and it depends on the age of the organ. I don't actually know if there's a standard, but if just from memory, because I've seen a lot of organs, because I've been around to a lot of churches with my dad as he plays, and I used to do that a lot as a child.
Sure.
I think it is 5 or 6 octaves. And the keyboard itself, it's kind of like a MIDI keyboard. The keyboard itself is not assigned to specific pitches or notes by default. The stops that you pull out will decide what pitch what octave that they are playing.
Oh, I see. Right. So that's what all those sort of knobs that are sticking out everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. So when you pull out one of those knobs, that's called a stop, which is where the fantastic English expression "pull the stops out."
Pull out all the stops.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Is that from organ? Oh.
Yeah, pull out all the stops basically means to turn on every pipe, which makes a massive noise. A massive noise.
Oh, I see. Oh, I always assumed it was to do with going quickly, but it's more, I suppose, going all in.
That's right. Something. Yeah, so if you pull out all the stops on a pipe organ, it is extremely loud.
Right.
Basically, every one of those, the best way to think of it is the very, very old-fashioned non-electronic, the mechanical organs. They'll have a blower at the back, which will be operated by electricity or by somebody. And on the really old organs that I've seen in Germany with my father, there is actually like an area at the back for the plebeians to stand there and actually pump the organ.
Right.
But you have to. It's actually quite difficult to pump the organ because if you do it with too much force and not evenly, then it changes the pitch.
Oh, like some wind instruments do that as well, right? Where you play twice as hard to do an octave up or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, that air is basically being routed to different pipes by the stops in front of the organist. So the organist will have, for example, on this manual, that's the name of the keyboards, they'll have this range of pipes that can be used for this one. And then maybe on the right-hand side, there'll be this range of pipes that can be used for this manual. And they will select which stops that they want, which will select which pipes are being used. And every one of the pipes will have a different sound. So the different timbres, basically. So that depends on the pipe size, length, material. So there's wooden pipes as well as metal pipes. Generally, the ones that you see out the front of the organ are all the metal ones because they look the most impressive. But behind that is a whole range of different kinds of pipes behind the facade of the organ. That's for achieving different kinds of timbres. And so depending on the music and the part of the music and what the composer was trying to achieve, and also, of course, what the organist is trying to achieve, the organist will select different stops for different timbres, assign them, basically choose which manual has which timbre on it, and play like that. And then using the left hand and the right hand, they'll prepare, before the music starts, they'll prepare, for example, on this manual will be this sound for this part of the music, and on that manual will be that sound for this part of the music.
Right.
Prepare it before they start.
Right.
And you may see, if you watch pipe organists play in larger, more complicated pieces of music, you'll see them actually changing the stops as they go along. So it all has to be very carefully planned that, at this part of the music, I need that sound here, so I'll just pull that up there.
Right.
And then that sound has to be here over here. And the more modern organs have electronic systems that allow you to sort of store presets of sounds.
Right.
And you'll see sometimes it'll happen automatically when you're watching an organist play. You'll see them press a button with their thumb underneath the keyboard or something like that, and all the stops will automatically kind of shift.
Right.
And
so they're still, even when it's automatic, they are still manually moving a sort of mechanical
Yes, that's
thing,
right. So there's no touch screen UI or anything like that for a pipe organ. They all are actually on modern organs. Obviously, the stops themselves are electronic, like there's a switch behind there. But on the traditional organs, it's actually a mechanical thing that you pull. It pulls a wire which shifts, a valve that moves the air from the blower from this side over to that side, and it's just an amazingly complicated instrument.
Oh, fascinating. And is it common in music, in musical notation and written music, to specify that, or is that usually left to the organist, or is it sort of depends on the music? In the same way that with a play, for example, Shakespeare, for example, doesn't give much in the way of stage directions. He just tells you who's coming on and who's going off, whereas Tennessee Williams gives a huge amount of detail in every single action that everyone's doing. Is it a similar sort of thing to that, or how does that work?
That is a question for my father, so I don't dare to answer that in case he's listening to this. But I seem to recall that I think there might be a mixture of both. So you'll get some situations, depending on the composer and the era, there'll be some situations where the composer specifically specifies, reed sounds here or principal pipes here or, all the names of the pipe organ is essentially a very, very early synthesizer in that every one of the stops, if you read them, they will say things like bassoon and oboe and flute, and they're sort of trying to approximate the sound of these actual instruments.
Right.
So in some of the music and with some composers, they will specify that, okay, this part should be this sound and that part should be that sound. On other kinds of music, it's not the case, and basically all you get are basic dynamics and cues for the kind of feel, whether it's like gently or powerfully or,
Right.
And then it's up to the organist's interpretation and their own, creative and artistic objectives to choose what sounds like.
All right, cool. Well, maybe we should leave the rest for future follow-up. Alex's dad, if you want to jump on the Reddit.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating. Yeah, it sounds really interesting.
Maybe we can just drop in a mention here of two of my favorite organ composers, just so that we can remember to put a link in the description so people can actually go and listen to what, amazing organ music can sound like. Obviously, J.S. Bach from the Baroque period is, pretty much a go-to as far as wonderfully, how do you describe J.S. Bach? I mean, the man. But definitely also it's worth having a listen to some of the later French organ music. And one specific piece of music that is probably my favorite piece of music for organ that I loved from a child when I first heard my father play it, and now listen to it every now and then when I want to be reminded of that amazing feeling of standing in a church listening to a massive organ play it, is by a composer called Guigou. And Guigou is not spelt Geegoo.
No.
It's actually spelt Gigout, like gig out.
Okay.
Guigou.
Sounds appropriately French.
Yes. Guigou's toccata, I believe it is in C. There's only one of his toccatas, I think, that was really, really famous. And I think it's in C.
Okay.
We can find a link later and post in the show notes. But
that'll be interesting to look up, because I don't think I've actually not listened to a lot of organ music. Even Bach, I've mostly sort of heard a lot of his stuff that was written for harpsichord and stuff. But
Guigou's toccata is really, there's only one word to describe it, and this word is far, far overused and kind of a little bit cliched and has definitely lost a lot of its power now, but the word really is epic. And when you listen to it, you'll see what I mean. It's like, wow, that's huge. So we'll post a link to Guigou's toccata and you can have a listen, but highly recommend it for one of the world's rarer but highly fascinating instruments, the pipe organ. There we go.
Links in the show notes. So I also have some Reddit-based follow-up, just very briefly.
Yep.
On the subscription model that we talked about towards the end of last episode.
Yes.
Just we talked about sort of how some people had been upset by it, and people were trying to find a way to sort of marry the subscription and traditional product-based models to try and get the advantages of the subscription without upsetting people too much.
Yeah.
But one thing we didn't talk about that Charlie from A-Town FM, he posted on the Reddit, which I hadn't really thought to mention last time, which is that the subscription model enables a certain class of updates that have traditionally been discouraged, which is small incremental updates and bug fixes and things like that. It's very hard to use those sorts of updates to sell a new product.
Right.
So with the traditional non-subscription model, the company making, Adobe making Photoshop or whatever, they are encouraged to push for big features that they can write on the back of the box that they can, use to encourage people to buy the next version.
Right.
And prioritize those over these small incremental changes. And Charlie, who is a subscriber to Adobe Creative Cloud, as are you, said that he really noticed the difference, that when they switched to a subscription model, they could focus a little bit more on stability and bug-related issues, and he felt like that was a great improvement. So there is an upside to it as well, and I thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And it's true, actually. Like you said, I'd also never thought of that. But, when I think about Adobe Creative Cloud, I think that we, as users, are so used to the idea that an update equals new features, something new. And, stability and speed and efficiency are things that you take for granted, and that software should just do that.
Right.
If you buy software, of course, you expect that it's going to work well and efficiently and without trouble. That's not the reality when you're dealing with highly, highly complicated, programs.
Right, and it doesn't come for free, even with simple programs,
exactly,
right? It
exactly.
costs a lot of time and effort to make things stable and efficient.
Exactly, and actually, I'm thinking now, of course, of my favorite Adobe software. Favorite because it's pretty much the only one that I am able to use with any degree of competency, and that's Adobe Illustrator.
Right.
And I can remember that when you were going through the Creative Suite illustrators, Creative Suite 1, 2, 3, I started on Illustrator 8, and it went 8, 9, 10, then Creative Suite 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then it's Creative Cloud. I believe that's right. But anyway, there was always this emphasis as they released new versions, like, Creative Suite 3, Creative Suite 4, that there had to be these like new features. And Illustrator has sort of gotten to a bit like Photoshop, it's sort of gotten to the point where it's like, okay, all right, we've got enough features now. It's starting to get very, very heavy and very sort of weighed down in its features.
Right.
Even though, when it comes to putting together, a great layout for graphic design or doing game graphics or things like that, you don't need that much of the extra features. What you need is for the program to stop crashing, and corrupting your save files and things like that.
Right.
And I think Illustrator is probably less of it's very interesting the way that Adobe has moved, because now it's almost like you can do most things in Photoshop that you can in Illustrator, and almost most things in Illustrator that you can in Photoshop to a certain degree. Like you can access vectors in Photoshop, and in Illustrator, to a certain degree, there's some control that you have over bitmap editing and bitmap effects.
Right.
Not editing, but I should say bitmap effects. And you can certainly create excellent bitmap art in Illustrator now, because there has all these modes for working to pixel resolution as opposed to working to infinite vector resolution for PostScript.
Right.
And so the line between them is blurred so much now that it's almost like, oh, which one do you like? Oh, I like Illustrator. Oh, really? Well, I like Photoshop. Okay, let's go and do the same work.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the sort of different interfaces converging on a similar point, I suppose. And I saw the other day somebody was tweeting that there's all these 3D features in Photoshop now. So not only can it do vector stuff, but you can actually describe 3D shapes and map textures onto them, and it's sort of weirdly turning into a 3D package.
Yeah, and by the same token, like I have Creative Cloud, but I mainly use Illustrator, and I rarely ever have a need to use Photoshop for anything, because most of the basic things that I would need to do can be done in Illustrator. So, so like on the one hand, new features are nice, although it does create this sort of soupy situation where your different products in the company sort of start to converge together. And now if somebody came to me and said, I'd like to make a logo what software would you recommend? It's like, well, they can all kind of do it now, so just take your pick.
Right.
However, there's something to be said for new features, but when we look at specifically digital audio workstations, DAWs are plagued by this expectation that new versions have to have new features. And an interesting example recently, sorry, I don't want to go on too long about this because I know we talked about DAWs last episode when we were talking about Bitweek, but Ableton is another one of the big players in DAWs, and they've just released, a few days ago, they've released Live 10, and Live is their flagship DAW product. And unlike Bitweek, which has that sort of pseudo subscription style, Ableton has a more traditional, you pay for the update and you pay for a new version, and then you get sort of free updates as you go along until the next major version, at which point there are all these fancy new features, or that's what people expect. And when Live 10 came out, basically it's an interface tweak. It's got a few, the interface looks quite different, and there's some improvements there, but it's kind of light on the new features. It's more about workflow.
Right.
And obviously, a lot of the user base are sort of complaining a lot because, this is a new version. If we have to pay this much for an upgrade, why aren't there new things that we can be using, that we can be benefiting from?
Right. Which, I go back to my point from before, but, well, you don't have to pay for an upgrade. That's what you asked for, isn't it? Like, you don't want a subscription model. It's like, well, okay, if you don't think the upgrade is worth it, don't pay for it.
Yeah.
And if that means that you end up with a sort of buggier, crashier version that doesn't have a smoother workflow, well, that was your choice. Right?
Yeah. Anyway, Charlie's point about subscription models allowing for sort of less feature-based updates and more stability, and basically what most people want. Well, no.
Right.
Basically what people complain the most about. Oh, it's crashing all the time. I paid this much for this buggy software.
Right.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting thought. That, well, if you wouldn't complain about them going to a subscription model, then maybe that would get you what you're after, which is this, stable tool instead of something that's highly functional but buggy.
All right.
So
anyway, and one more piece of follow-up from a couple of episodes ago, but I did say that my New Year's resolution, I said I would go to the gym once by mid-February.
yes.
Here we are, approaching mid-February, and I went yesterday, so that's one New Year's resolution in the bag.
Nice. You're sorted already, and it's only the second month of the year, and you're
I told you I'm good at this.
on track. You are on track. So are you buff now? Are you swole?
My one gym visit has made all the difference.
Right.
Yeah. No, actually, it's made no difference at all. But it was good to see it's my first gym experience in America. I just went to there's a place at work, so I just went there.
Right.
And they've got nice machines, fairly comparable with the place that I used to go to in Japan.
Right.
I think did I mention before when, the place that I went to in Japan had very nice, fancy gym equipment. It was a very nice place and all that. But they also had a sort of sauna area, and in Japan, public baths are like a thing.
Right.
So they've got a shared sort of public bath as well as individual showers, and one of those cold ice plunge things as well, with cold water that you go into straight after the sauna.
Right.
And over the course of the months that I went to that gym, I found that the time that I spent in the gym using the equipment, as compared to the time that I spent in the sauna and the nice bath relaxing, shifted over the few months that I was going.
The ratio was in flux.
The ratio swung
Right.
from about 2/3 in the gym and 1/3 in the bath to, probably the reverse of that.
Right.
By the end. So at this place, they have, they've got some of that. They've got saunas, and they've got like what they call a hot tub, I guess, like a jacuzzi type thing. But being America, and Americans are a bit funny about getting their bits out, so you have to wear swimwear,
right,
to go into the bath jacuzzi thing.
That's interesting.
Which, yeah, is obviously quite different from Japan. Did you go to onsen and sento? Onsen are hot springs with natural hot spring water, and sento is basically the same thing but artificial, just a hot public bath. But in Japan, you treat them both as a bath. You shower first before you go in, and then you go in naked. Did you used to do that in Japan?
This will shock anybody who's ever been a tourist in Japan or even has the most basic passing interest in Japanese culture and society. But actually, after living in Japan for 16 years, I went to an onsen the grand total of 1 time.
Oh, really? Right at the end?
And basically at the end with my, at that stage, my toddler son and my wife. And I didn't enjoy it, to be honest.
Oh, really?
It was so hot that after about 5 minutes, I started to get quite a bad headache.
Yeah.
And then I got out and realized that I must have been perhaps dehydrating from sweating too much or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I drank a whole bunch of water. And the headache didn't really pass for the next few hours. It just sort of felt very uncomfortable. And
yeah, well, you got to be careful. But I think it's unfortunate that was your first experience. I do know what you mean. I have sort of experienced that, but that's not a thing that's definitely going to happen.
Okay.
I think you do need to make sure to be well hydrated before you go, and also when you're finished, you should drink afterwards as well.
Right.
And also, it can take a bit of getting used to, like, the managing it almost.
Right.
Like, you don't tend to just get in the bath and then sit there for half an hour.
Right.
And then leave. Like, you sort of, I find at least I'm sort of constantly adjusting. I mean, often they'll have lots of different baths, right? With different things. Like, they'll have the main bath, and then they'll have an outdoors one, and they'll have one with little electric shocks that go through you that are supposed to be good in some way. Not a big fan.
Right.
Literally, they are blasting electricity into a bath in which you are sitting.
Right.
And, and they'll have jacuzzi type things and all sorts of things that massage different sort of areas of your body. So, sometimes by moving between these, you get a bit of a break as you're standing up and moving from one place to the other. But also, even, in when there's just one main bath, you sit in there immersed for like maybe 5 minutes, and then you'll just sit up on the edge and just have your feet in the bath, and the rest of you out of the water for a few minutes.
Right.
And you're sort of constantly, like, I think there is a bit of a knack to getting a feel for how it's affecting your body and how you're feeling, and whether you want to take a break or whatever.
Right.
But it can be a really pleasurable experience when you've kind of got the knack.
Yeah. In my case, I was in there for 5 minutes, started to get quite a bad headache, and thought, okay, I think I probably should get out now, and got out and started to feel quite dizzy. So I thought, all right, I think I'll probably stop here. So that's
right. Yeah, no, and that's a sensible thing to do in that case. I think you definitely did the right thing, given that maybe you weren't fully hydrated when you started.
Right.
But if you get another opportunity, I say don't discount it yet.
Okay.
Because it can be a very nice thing, and also, I think for someone like you as well, it's quite well suited. But I've had some great conversations with random old Japanese men in the bar. Because you meet sort of all sorts of different people, right?
Right.
Generally, all the people from that area are sort of going to that particular bath, or if you're in like a resort, then you're meeting people from all sorts of areas that have come to the resort to experience it.
Right.
So you can meet a whole variety of different people that you wouldn't usually meet. And the fact that you're all sort of sitting naked in a bath together is a great equalizer.
Right. Right.
And yeah, I think it's maybe feels a bit weird when you first do it, but it's a great place to have a conversation. I mean, between that and sort of old man pubs, as I used to call them in England, but bars full of old men. I think they're great places to sort of just meet random people and have conversation. And in the sauna in the gym that I went to, they always had the sumo on in the corner. And so I'd end up, and I always went before work. So I'd be going like 7 a.m,
right,
do my requisite 5 minutes of exercise or whatever.
Right.
And then, and then go have a shower, get in the sauna, and just spend ages just chatting with these old men about what's going on in the sumo. It was great.
The mind boggles like what it would be like in one of these old British pubs if you walked in and everybody was naked except for a towel over their bits. Like how?
Yeah, I should be clear that the old man pubs and the being naked are different stories.
Because you wonder like how you go into an old man's pub and you sit down with a beer and you strike up a conversation with the guy next to you. Like if he was naked and you were naked and you had a towel over your bits and it was really hot, that's essentially without the beer.
Right.
That's essentially what we're talking about.
Yes. I mean, yes. Context is king in this case, I think.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's good to know about onsens because, of course, it's definitely up there with one of the more popular things that people enjoy doing when they go to visit Japan, along with climbing Mount Fuji and shopping in Tokyo and eating a lot in Osaka and seeing monkeys in hot springs in Nagano, I think was one of the other ones that tourists like, or red leaves in the autumn and all that stuff. Yeah. Sakura in the...
Crossing a road in Shibuya.
Yeah, that's right. The famous road.
All the fascinating things Japan has to offer. Crossing a road, having a bath.
Yes. So I also wanted to... I apologize for taking this back to music, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an update on my band exploits because on Monday... which was a few days ago from this recording, I went to the first practice for this band group that I'm in.
Oh, yeah, you said that was coming up. How did that go? Did you meet all 100 people? Do you remember their names?
Yeah, so, okay, slow down. So, yeah, we were there it was a 2-hour practice, and basically it was a choir practice, so it was specifically a practice for the choir. However, the choir master had asked the guitarist and myself, the bassist, to come along and accompany just to provide a little bit of extra support for the choir.
Sure.
There were 100 people. And so basically I went in, there was a stage, and on the stage there was the guitarist, and I had bass amp, and I was on the stage, and the choir master was next to us at a piano. And then down in the main area there were seats with 100 singers, all looking at the stage. And it was a bit funny because, it's of course not the first time that I've been on a stage with people looking at me, but definitely the first time that I've been on stage with people looking at me when I'm not actually doing anything, because a lot of the time in this case, it was sort of standby because we were waiting as the choir master was helping, individual parts in the choir.
Right.
With it. So it was kind of hard to know where to look, because if I looked out, then there's like 100 eyes looking back at me. And so I kind of tend looking at people's shoes and looking at my music and looking at the bass and looking at the floor. And so that was a bit funny. However, what I wanted to talk about, this was quite a special experience because the sound, when you're on stage in front of 100 people singing at you at fairly close proximity. Now, this is obviously not the first time I've heard a choir, and not the first time I've sung in a choir. I didn't sing this time, but like I know what choirs are about.
Right.
This was something pretty remarkable, and I wanted to tell you about this because there's a discussion behind this too. So when the choir sang together, it was absolutely mesmerizing, and it took me a while to work out why it sounded the way that it did. And I was reminded of one of the famous quotes about ABBA, where the two ladies of ABBA, Anna Frida and Agneta, the tone of their voices, one of them has a slightly higher voice and the other one has a slightly lower voice. One of them is a bit more full-bodied and the other one is a bit more nasal. And when they sing together, there's a certain quality to the mixture of their voices that you can hear is very distinctive when you listen to any song by ABBA. And it's fairly well known in mixing circles that the combination of those two women's voices is one of the more special combinations of voices in music recording, because they complemented each other so perfectly that on a recording it just creates this mysterious, phasey, kind of soupy, creamy sound, which is very, very unique. And I have some other examples of that, but that's part of the discussion that I wanted to raise with you. But coming back to the choir, so in front of 100 voices, when they sang together and in harmony, it was mesmerizing. Again, like the sound that ABBA had. It was kind of this weirdly, again, creamy is really the only word that I can think to describe it. And during the break, I approached the choir master and she said, thanks for coming. And I said, this is absolutely incredible. I've never really heard anything like this before. It's like this kind of soupy, creamy sound. And she said, yeah, actually, Swedish choirs are quite well known for their unique sound because...
Oh, really?
Yeah, because there is something to do with Swedish pronunciation and the way that it forms a person's voice and the voice that they get used to using that creates this rather unique kind of tone. And she did it for me. Being a singing teacher, she can do it. It was kind of like this, I don't know, it was kind of like this sort of nasally tone.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, that
I
was...
can see why you were so blown away by it.
Creamy, mesmerizing, soupy. Yeah. So she did it for me. She said, yeah, Swedish people have this funny tone in their voice and it sounds like this. And when you put it all together... Like when they're singing with that overtone in there, it creates this unique sound. And amongst choir circles, these kinds of large-scale Swedish choirs become very popular around Europe because of this unique sound. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. We went back to the practice. And then as they sang again, because the choir was practicing, and bear in mind, this is an amateur choir.
Right.
So these are not professional singers. These are basically people there singing purely for the enjoyment of it and also for the experience of participating in this kind of large concert, which is what this is aiming up towards.
Sure.
Even though they're amateurs, sometimes the tuning, the intonation was a little bit off, but once they hit it, it was this amazing kind of consistent, phasey tone. Really, the only kind of equivalent I can think of is sort of effects in digital audio world, or like audio production world, like certain kinds of chorus effects or flange effects that can create this kind of really unique sound. It occurred to me when I thought a bit more then about ABBA, there are a number of bands where you can actually hear this sound. Mm-hmm. And I have two to give you. And in both cases, these are bands where the musicians are brothers and sisters. So that maybe then is... I don't know, potentially some kind of connection there, that obviously your siblings are fairly likely to have a similar toned voice as you.
Right.
Fairly likely. And the two bands that I can think of, aside from ABBA, one of them is an amazing Irish folk group called Clannad.
Oh, yeah.
One of my absolute favourites, especially... in the sort of 70s, it was folk music. In the 80s, they moved more towards a sort of a pop sound. And they did the soundtrack of a great British action series from the 80s called Robin of Sherwood. They also did the soundtrack for The Last of the Mohicans and another movie called Harry's Game. And do you know the ambient singer Enya?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so Enya is the younger sister of this group of 4 or 5 brothers and sisters who form Clannad.
Oh, right. I didn't realize that. I know Enya, obviously, and I have sort of heard of Clannad, but I didn't realize there was a relation between them.
Yeah, so Clannad is a bunch of sisters and brothers, and they also have this capability that when they all sing together, it sounds kind of like a synthesizer. I mean, it's like, again, this sort of very, very consistent... creamy kind of sound. The other band, which may come to some surprise, but actually when you think about it, is also in this category, is the Bee Gees. So
that is not what I was expecting you to say.
Yeah, so the Bee Gees, the Bee Gees are also 3 brothers, and of course they're most famous for their falsetto singing and 70s and 80s disco music like Saturday Night Fever and all that. But if you listen to those three brothers singing at the same time in their falsetto voices or not, because they also have very similar voices. They get that same effect where their voices just sort of mesh together so perfectly that it just creates this very, very unique, interesting sound.
That's interesting. Can you think of a song of theirs that sort of demonstrates that in particular? Or?
Let's see. No, I have to go back and listen. Probably How Deep Is Your Love, perhaps, which is a ballad song. I can't recall whether or not that song has much harmony singing, or whether it's because it's most well known for its the main melody sung by Barry, I think was his name. Anyway, have you ever heard this with voices where it's clear that okay, that's a little bit unique. That sound is There's got to be something behind that. It's not just a case of two people singing together and slapped on some, chorus effects in post-production.
Right.
Have you ever heard that in any of the music that you enjoy?
I definitely know what you mean. So I have heard it, and I can sort of envisage in my mind the effect that you're talking about. But I can't actually think of a specific example of bands that take advantage of that.
Right. Yeah, tone of voice is a fascinating thing. And there's, when we think about language, we think about pronunciation primarily. However, tone of voice and the actual voice that you have, everybody's voice sounds different. And the tone of voice that you have actually goes a long way to making your pronunciation in a foreign language that much more convincing.
Right.
And, a fine example I can remember of this was when I lived in China, when I was studying Mandarin Chinese there. I tended to find that people who naturally had a more nasally voice when they spoke in Chinese, assuming that all people spoke with the exact same level of accuracy with their pronunciation, you would get some people that would sound, wow, that pronunciation is perfect. And of course, Chinese is a tonal language, so it's going up and down.
Right.
And the actual pronunciation of the vowels and the consonants, and it's all just perfect. However, that is without a doubt a Westerner speaking Chinese, or like a foreigner speaking Chinese.
Right.
Whereas on the other hand, you would get some people, and as I said, I found it tended to be people with a more nasally voice who would be speaking, and it would sound absolutely perfect, like mostly native. And I kind of wondered whether there is a case for just basically having a voice that's more suited to this language, because in general, people who speak this language have this kind of voice, and if you have that kind of voice, it's easier.
Or whether that's even something you can develop,
right?
Because we think about the differences in pronunciation and getting used to vowel sounds we don't have in our native language, and learning to roll our R's for certain languages, and when we don't do that in our own native language or whatever, and also intonation and Japan's pitch accents and Chinese's tones and stress in other languages. And those are all things that we're taught very explicitly and we think about. But you're right that sort of tone, not in the sense of Chinese tones, but in the sense of how full-bodied your voice is, how nasal it is, how deep it is, that is something that is not really often taught and is taken to be just a property of your voice. And to some extent, it probably is. But I think there is an extent to which it can be trained. I mean, I know that my voice is quite different in Japanese and English. I think it's still recognizably the same voice, but I do think I talk a lot more quietly in Japanese. And I think at a slightly higher pitch, probably. I think that a lot of that is down to a confidence that still, even now, although I'm fairly comfortable talking in Japanese, probably because I've always been in the habit of it, that early habit of talking much more hesitantly and in a quieter voice, and sort of always with a question mark at the end because I want to make sure the other person has understood what I've said and stuff like that. I think to some extent that habit is stuck. And so it's resulted in I think I have a different sort of tone of voice in Japanese to English. And perhaps if that had been something I'd explicitly worked on, that could contribute to sounding more native, as you say.
When you speak multiple languages, having your voice change between those languages, that's very common. And it's a mystery as well, isn't it? I wouldn't like to imagine why, because it's definitely true. I mean, when I speak English, when I speak the foreign language, which to me is Japanese, my voice goes lower.
Yes. I was about to say, I've noticed that about you.
Yeah, and when I speak English, it's higher. And I can also, one of my colleagues that I work with who is Swedish, when she speaks English, her voice is higher. When she speaks Swedish, her voice is quite a bit lower. And like why that could come to be that way? Is it something to do with basically you have the target sound that you're going after when you're learning a language, and at that moment your vocal cords is trying to figure out how to actually achieve that sound, and it finds that the easiest way to do it is with this, and that arbitrarily could be a higher voice or a lower voice. It just happens to be
Possibly.
what your voice gets used to when it's training, perhaps.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, it could partly be just what you've picked up, the particular places that you learn from, the particular things that you're listening to, or it could be a confidence thing, like I said, with the Japanese. Actually, so as another example, and this also is a sort of convenient segue into another thing I was thinking of talking about, but with Spanish, which is a language that I've sort of on and off tried to learn for many years and not really gotten very far with. But I find I have yet to test this in proper conversation, talking Spanish with Spanish people, because I've not really done that so much. But when I'm just reading things to myself, like reading out loud from a book or something, I find that my voice goes lower for Spanish, but it goes higher for Japanese. So it's not even like, my English voice is at one tone and then my foreign language voice is at another, but I'm actually ending up picking different tones for different languages, which is interesting. Although, as I say, we'll have to find out whether, if I was actually to talk Spanish in conversation with someone, whether that same issue with confidence that I talked about before with Japanese kicks in and I end up talking in a high-pitched voice after all. That has yet to be tested. So that while I'm on the subject of that, just related, backtracking a little bit to New Year's resolutions.
Yeah.
At the time that we talked about it before, I hadn't actually really considered it. And I said at the time that I don't really, I don't like to do New Year's resolutions just for the sake of it. And I prefer to do ones that I think I can achieve and have, specific, preferably fairly measurable goals. And often with some ulterior motive of like, this is the reason I'm doing this New Year's resolution. It's not just because of a New Year's resolution, but it's because of some other thing, right?
Right.
And so when we talked about it, I wasn't actually originally planning on doing a New Year's resolution that year, but since we were recording a podcast, I figured I had to say something. So I said, go to the gym once, and now I've done it.
Right.
But I have thought of another one.
Okay.
And I think this is a better one, which is that later in the year, this autumn, I am actually going to be going to Spain.
Oh, wow.
So as we mentioned before, I was born in Spain, and I haven't been back there for many, many years. I think over 10 years ago was the last time I went. But I was born in a town in the south called Marbella, and I'm going to be visiting there, and then from there going up to Granada and to Cordoba. So getting a few cities in the south of Spain.
Fantastic.
And that seems like an opportunity to deal with what I've alluded to before, but I've almost had a bit of a complex about not being able to speak Spanish. I know it's that's giving it too grand a term, but I grew up in Spain, but I went to an international school, so the main language at my school was English. And my parents speak Spanish, and my younger sister speaks Spanish. So everyone apart from me in my family speaks Spanish.
Right.
And, when I studied it at GCSE, so it's not like I've never done it. GCSEs, for our American listeners, are like owls in Harry Potter, if that helps clear it up at all.
Maybe it helps for the American listeners, but what about for all the other listeners? What's a GCSE?
I don't know what the American system is, but in my experience, most Americans know about the Harry Potter system, which map fairly cleanly to the English system. Okay. So, owls are like GCSEs and newts are like A levels. So GCSEs are the general. You do about 10 or 12 of them at about 16.
Okay,
and they're the sort of exams that you do then.
Right.
So I did study Spanish. I think I got a B. But I always had myself pegged, as I mentioned once before, as someone who wasn't very good at languages. And I only convinced myself that I could do it when I moved to Japan and learned Japanese.
Right.
And every now and then, even while I was in Japan, I've thought, I really should go back and try and actually be able to speak Spanish. And every time I tried it in Japan, I knew quite a few people from Spanish-speaking countries in Japan. And I'd try and talk Spanish with them, but within minutes, I would not be able to think of a word. And this instinct that I had managed to train in myself to be able to make time to try and think of the word in Japanese kicked in. And so I just switched to Japanese accidentally. And then the rest of the conversation was in Japanese. So I always sort of failed. So this year, here is a target.
Yeah.
By the time I go to Spain, which is in like 7 or 8 months or something, I would like to be able to at least hold a basic conversation comfortably without accidentally talking to them in Japanese or indeed in English.
Is that resolution measurable? Like, what is a basic conversation?
That's just it. It's not ideal as a resolution because it's not really measurable. It's not like I would like to be able to pass this particular exam.
And it's not like I'm going to go to a gym once this year, and which you've already achieved.
Which I've already done.
That's measurable.
Right, yeah. or once a week, which I'm not committing to, but would be measurable, right?
Right.
This is less measurable, but it does have in its favor that it's got a specific deadline, which is, when I go to Spain. And it's got a specific purpose, right? It's a thing I'm actually going to do. It's not some vague ambition.
Right.
So it's got that in its favor. I could set something more concrete, like have passed this exam or have learned this many words, whatever learned means, put into Anki or something.
Right.
But I'm not doing that because I don't find those metrics particularly useful.
Right.
For language learning. The most useful, even though it's not concrete or measurable, the most useful sort of metric that I've found is if I talk to a random stranger in a bar, can we enjoy the conversation or is it awkward for both of us? Right?
But doesn't that depend on the person? Because if it happens to be a very, very talkative, friendly, interesting person who's eager to talk to you regardless of your ability in the language, that's obviously going to go much better than somebody who's very, very antisocial or quiet.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely true. In order to get a good picture of it, I think you'd have to talk to a few people in bars and take the average.
Right.
But so in terms of actual steps that I'm taking to try and do this, I've dialed the Greek right back because I was already really at the limit of the amount of time I could afford to give to the Greek, and I didn't have any more time to give to Spanish on top of that. So I've reduced the Greek. I've not stopped it entirely. I'm introducing 2 new cards in Anki per day. I may even put that back down to 1 even, but just so that there's a little drip. There's not like, because if you turn off the tap completely, then when you want to start it back up again, you kind of feel like you've taken a lot of steps back. So I don't want to sort of lose everything I've done in the last year with Greek. But the focus this year is going to be on the Spanish more than the Greek. So I'm going to be introducing 1 new card of Greek per day, and then Anki will sort of keep me going with the stuff I've already learned. And with the Spanish, I've dialed that up to 10. So I'm introducing 10 cards in Anki per day, and that's my sort of regular, most measurable statistic.
Sorry, I don't know if we've covered this already, but what is Anki?
Oh, okay. So yeah, I don't know. I think I mentioned it briefly when we were talking about language before, but maybe it's worth mentioning again. Anki is a piece of software which is essentially flashcard software. Right. So, it makes cards, it shows you some question or sentence or something like that,
right.
And then you press a button, it shows you the back of the card, and you rate yourself on how well you did.
I see.
And that card could be a number of things, right? It could just be a very simple question with an answer on the back. And then if you got the answer right, you rate yourself good. And if you got the answer wrong, you rate yourself as fail. Or it could be a bit more nuanced than that. And there's a real science and an art to designing these cards, which maybe I'll talk about in a bit because I think it's really interesting. Then what happens is, based on how you rate yourself, it schedules when it is next going to show you that card.
I see.
So the thing that it offers over and above like traditional actual physical flashcards is that it can prioritize cards based on when it thinks it would be a good time to show them to you.
Okay.
So with a traditional flashcard system, you just randomly look at cards, and depending on where the dice roll, you may not end up looking at a particular card for a year or something, just because you never randomly drew it, right? And so you might just totally forget what was on that card. Or you might end up looking at the same card every week, despite the fact that you already totally know that thing. So to try and avoid that from happening, Anki tries, based on your own rating of yourself, to estimate when you are just about to forget the card, forget the thing that the card is testing.
I see.
But won't have quite forgotten it, because that's when they reckon is the most efficient time to show you. If they show you any sooner than that, then it's not really a problem. It's just inefficient, right? You end up looking at more cards than you need to. If they show you later than that, then you've already forgotten the thing and you need to sort of relearn it. So the ideal time to show you would be the moment just before you forget it, but when it's still sort of resident in your reasonably short-term memory. And then by keeping on sort of reminding you at that perfect time, it ends up being sort of moving into longer and longer term memory. That's the theory. Obviously, judging the actual perfect time to show you is impossible. So sometimes it gets it wrong. Sometimes it shows you earlier than it would need to, in which case you don't really notice, but you end up doing more cards. Sometimes it will show you later and you'll forget. So on average, if you're doing, say, or I tend to be scheduled about 70 or 80 cards per day at the moment, and I might get about 5 of them wrong. So that means that some 6 or 7% of the cards that it is scheduled, it actually scheduled for me a little bit later than it should have. And if it had shown them to me a bit earlier, maybe I would have remembered them and I wouldn't have got them wrong.
So this is primarily for learning vocabulary?
I would say this is for, well, it's very good for anything that involves rote learning.
I see.
Which might be vocabulary, or it might be grammar, verb tables and things like that.
Oh, I see.
But it's also good for exposure in a sense. It doesn't stand on its own. It's not a silver bullet. And you can't just say, okay, well, if I put things in Anki, then that's all I need to do. And so long as I go through my cards every day, I will be fluent by X date or something like that.
Right.
You do need to support it with other techniques, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment. But in terms of what you actually put in Anki, you can put vocabulary, although I'm not a big fan of vocabulary taken out of context, because you can sort of see a word and it gets mapped to some English word, and it's not usually a direct mapping. So that can be a bit problematic.
Right.
Another approach you can take with vocabulary, which is what I'm doing in Spanish, because I do, like I said, I have studied Spanish before, so I'm starting from a higher point than I did with Japanese or with Greek.
Right.
So I can already muddle through a lot of dictionary definitions of words in Spanish. So a type of card that I'm doing sometimes at the moment is to take a word, look up that word's definition in the Royal Academy of Spain official dictionary,
right,
which is a Spanish dictionary, right? It's like the Oxford English Dictionary for English.
Okay.
And if I understand that definition, then I'll put that on the card. And so I actually generate 2 cards from that. So I'll put the word on the front and the definition on the back. And then when I see that, if I understood the word, then that's marked as a pass. And I'll also make the reverse version of that card. So the definition on the front, and I have to come up with the word.
Right.
So that's just one way to kind of keep it in Spanish. Another thing that I actually do more of, which I think is good for giving you that context, is that I will take an entire sentence from some Spanish source, and then depending on the sentence and the source, I might just put an English translation of that entire sentence on the back.
Right.
Or I might look up the particular words in that sentence that I didn't know, that I had to look up, and do the same thing with the Spanish dictionary. Find the Spanish definition of that word and put that on the back.
Right.
And sometimes a mix. Sometimes I'll look up one word in a sentence and I'll look it up in the Spanish dictionary and understand the definition and go, okay, I'll put that in. Sometimes I'll look it up in a Spanish dictionary and still have no idea what it means. And then I'll switch to a Spanish-English dictionary and I'll just paste the English definition in. So I'm quite flexible about that.
Right.
But the idea with those then is just comprehension. So I don't make the reverse version of that. I don't have an English sentence and say, now produce the Spanish sentence. And the reason I don't do that is because there's usually many ways to express a particular thing.
Right.
So if you're shown an English sentence and you have to try and write it in Spanish, there's probably a variety of ways you could write it. And so I don't find those cards to be particularly useful. So I tend to focus on the recognition. Now, obviously, one thing with doing that is you need to find sentences, right? And if you want to be able to put the English translation of the sentence, you're either doing your own translations, in which case you need to be quite confident you're right, or you need to find a sentence which has English versions available. And I've actually found a couple of neat tricks recently to do this. Actually, before I get to that, one thing that I've done in the past when I was doing Japanese is I would take movies which were subtitled in both English and Japanese, and I would use those as sources, and those are quite good because you can actually pull out the audio as well and include that.
Yeah.
But another trick that I've realized recently that I tweeted and I feel didn't get nearly as much uptake as it deserved. I was really pleased with this, and I got like one retweet, but never mind. I think people should be shouting this from the rooftops. This feels like a revelation.
I'm just having a look for it now as you talk.
Here it is, right? Download the Kindle sample for a book that is available in both Spanish and English.
Right.
Download both samples. And the great thing about this is it's free for the sample, right?
Right.
And unless you're really advanced in the language, the length of a sample, which will usually be like the first chapter of the book or something, that's going to take you ages to get through if you're a relative beginner. So it'll last you get a lot of content for free. And then once you get to the sort of end of that, you can choose to buy it if you want to, or you can just download the sample for another book. So there's a whole wealth of bilingual, real sort of literary content available on Amazon. So I wish that was a thing that I thought of doing when I was first studying Japanese. But I was quite pleased when I thought of that. So I'm currently going through a book which is originally written in English, actually. It's a book by Patrick Rothfuss called The Name of the Wind. And I've downloaded the Spanish version of that and the English version. And I've also downloaded the audiobook in Spanish. And I'm sort of just going through that and then making Anki cards by taking the Spanish and the English versions and looking up any words that I don't know. And then in the background, just whenever I've got free time, I listen through the Spanish audiobook. And it's great if I go back, so I listen through, and obviously the audiobook overtakes how quickly I can go through and actually look up all the words and everything in the written book really quickly. So I end up running way ahead in the audiobook. But then occasionally, after I've got through like a chapter or something of the written book, I'll go back and listen to that chapter again in the audiobook. And it's like night and day. It's so motivating and so great to listen back through something which I sort of half hazily understood the first time I listened to it. And then just a couple of weeks later, after having gone through this process and added all these cards to Anki and looked up all the words I didn't know and stuff like that, just to be able to sort of, the clarity that you get is really nice and quite motivating. So that's one of the main techniques I'm using at the moment.
Your dedication to the academic side of learning a language, and of course the practical side that comes with that, and actually going out and trying to talk to people as well, is extremely admirable. And I would say that anybody out there who's thinking about learning a language, this is a fine example of the passion and the enthusiasm that will actually get you there to actually learning a language on your own. I'm reminded a bit of when I was a language teacher in Japan, when I first got to Japan. Japanese people have an interesting approach to learning language, which is often not helpful for them in some ways, and it's not their fault. It's just that, Japanese education is so centered around rote learning and memorization and basically, like the flashcard style of learning things where you have one thing and you need to remember what it is in another thing, that in a lot of cases I can remember Japanese language learners would get into a situation where their academic knowledge far surpassed their actual practical ability because they had so much in there that when it actually came to a practical situation where they're put on the spot and they have to actually use some of that memorized knowledge, the famous expression that most people used was atama ga mashiro ni naru, which means my mind just goes blank.
Right.
And there's like there's so many words packed in there that they've successfully memorized. And if they're looking at a flashcard, they can tell you, oh, in English, that's this. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to actually being on the spot and producing it, it's like there's so much baggage, there's so much weight, and it's hard for them to be nimble with thinking about how they should react to a situation.
Right.
And one of the core pieces of advice that I can remember that we used to give from the company that I used to work at, it's really, rather than learning vocabulary is very, very key after a certain point. But before that point, learning expressions and learning full sentences.
Yes.
Not in order to produce. Okay, so it was often misunderstood that in order to use this sentence, I need to be in exactly the situation where this sentence is relevant.
Right.
And if not, I can't use it. And that's of course ridiculous because if you have an expression like, "Excuse me, may I have the bill, please?"
Right.
Of course, there'll be situations where you just can't use that, or situations where it's not quite right to be saying, "Excuse me, can I have the bill, please?" Depending on whatever the context is. But the construction of that sentence, "Excuse me," is one block.
Right.
Can I have the bill, please? That construction will then allow you to replace those word parts with other things to create your sentence eventually.
Right.
But
yeah, like that notion of sort of sentence patterns, where just a few common patterns, that if you can produce those patterns without even having to think, then you only have to think about almost the variables, right?
That's
the
right.
things, the words you replace in the appropriate slots
That's
in the
right.
pattern.
Yeah, but it's really, really key that the one piece of advice I can remember giving very frequently is that you must match your study technique with the actual practical application of the language that you're aiming for.
Right.
So if your goal is to be able to talk to people, then you've got to talk to people.
Yes.
And that's it sounds obvious, but when you're learning English in Japan, and there's actually very few opportunities to talk to anybody in English, it's not that easy.
Right.
And it's easy to think that the English industry, like pretty much any industry in Japan, it's flooded with products and services and thousands of ways to spend your money on the idea of learning English. But sadly, the actual real opportunity to be challenged in an English conversation is very, very rare. And that's not just the problem that's not just a characteristic with Japan. That's any country with any language, really.
Right.
English in Europe is perhaps a slightly different situation because so many people can speak it. But in Japan, that's certainly the case, that people would be easily distracted by spending their money on tools in order to help their academic learning of English. So learning all of this vocabulary or studying all of this grammar. However, without their goal was to speak to somebody in English, because they're not able to actually practice that. It's basically the equivalent of, trying to learn tennis by buying tennis magazines and buying rackets and buying tennis balls and learning everything there is about the motion of the tennis arm and, the angle of impact and all of that, but not actually getting out there on the court.
Right. Yeah. No, that is true. And I want to be clear about what I'm trying to do. All this talk about Anki and sentences and mining things out of Kindle books and things like that. That ideally would be a minor part of the study. That, as I've said before, I give about 30 to 40 minutes a day to this Anki program, which I do in the morning on the bus on the way to work. So just before my day has even really started, I try and get the whole thing out of the way. And so that is not intended to form the majority of my efforts with Spanish or with Japanese as it was before.
I see.
The other two important things, essentially, are input and output, right? Input being listen to audiobooks, listen to radio, watch TV, and output being talk. And sometimes you can even combine the two in what's called a conversation. That was a big part of what I did in Japan. Before I went to Japan, I loaded up on input. So I watched hundreds of hours of dramas and anime and things like that. And then when I went there, I actually got into talking to people and trying to exercise the conversation side of things quite quickly, which I also think was very, very helpful because it builds up instincts, like what you said with the sentence patterns. That's what you really need to sort of feel is like an instinctive thing that you can just blurt out, and then that buys you time to think of the things that you're going to fill in the gaps with. And that only comes with practice. Now with Spanish, I'm obviously not in Spain, and so I'm trying to think what I can do to get practice in spoken Spanish. There is a service which I've discovered recently, which is called italki.com.
Right.
italki, I think. I'll put a link in the show notes.
Okay.
I haven't tried it out yet, but it's essentially like an eikaiwa, like a conversation practice service. Or they do have professional teachers as well. They've got it's multi-tier. So for free, you can do language exchange, where you meet people and you swap back and forth between your language and their language. For a small fee, you can do like a conversation class where you connect to an amateur speaker of the target language, i.e. a native speaker of the target language, but not a qualified teacher.
Right.
And you're only you sort of choose. You don't owe them anything because you're paying them, right? So
right.
You don't have to talk in your language if you don't want to. You can, and you can ask them questions and things like that. And then for a higher fee, you can actually connect with an actual teacher, and they will have lesson plans and things like that they'll teach you. So I'm thinking of trying that out in the mid-range one, because I don't really want, I like to set my own course. So I don't really feel like I want a proper teacher at this stage, but I don't really want to do the conversation exchange. So there's that, and that's usually like an hour once or twice a week. Still not as good as being able to just go out to the pub, which is what I did in Japan mostly, and other social situations. But it's a start.
Well,
now the other possibility. Oh, sorry. What were you?
I was just going to say that you're in a great country for opportunities to speak Spanish, though.
Right. Well, that's the other thing, and a great state of a great country. In California, there's obviously a lot of native Spanish speakers. Different kind of Spanish to what I'm used to, because it's Latin American Spanish and not European Spanish. But they're like American English and English, as far as I can tell. They're totally mutually intelligible, so
right,
not so bad. There is a bit of a funny thing here, though. I haven't quite got a good feeling about where I can go and where it's appropriate and so forth. But I don't feel comfortable just talking to someone in Spanish here, even if Spanish is their first language, in the same way that I would doing the same thing in Spain. And there's a lot of very complicated issues involved with that, and complicated American politics with the Spanish-speaking world, especially at the moment. But, in Japan, a lot of particularly native English speakers get annoyed with Japanese people when they try and talk to them in English, and they feel like they're being racist. You must have encountered that, right? A lot of, I'm sure a lot of people that we know have this sort of idea in their head that if a Japanese person sort of defaults to speaking to them in English, then they're assuming that they can't speak Japanese, and they're, and it's insulting.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I've never actually experienced that myself for a number of reasons, but yeah, I know what you mean.
Right.
I've heard of that.
And I have experienced it, but I personally don't get particularly annoyed by it.
Right.
I sort of understand it to some extent, and depending on the person and what their attitude is, they may genuinely be, like taking your advice when you were an English teacher and saying, okay, I'm going to go out and have some conversation practice.
Right.
So, want to help them out in that sense. But there's definitely some people that get really annoyed by it.
Right.
And there are some situations where it is genuinely annoying, right? There are some situations where somebody speaks very bad English and they are maybe serving you in a train station or a restaurant or something, and they just refuse to engage in Japanese, even though they don't understand what you're saying in English. And then when you try and say it in Japanese, that can be an annoying situation. I feel like there's a bit of a similar attitude here sometimes. That if you talk Spanish to some people here, they get a bit sensitive and start saying, we speak English too.
I see.
And it's a bit delicate.
I see. I see now. Yeah, I understand now.
You see what I mean? And this is not everyone by any means. And I think there's a way around it. I think if you can be respectful and make it clear that it's like, you don't think you're doing them a favor by talking to them in Spanish,
right?
But you're asking them to help you.
Yeah.
And you're being very upfront about that.
Yeah, you wouldn't, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that people might think that it's a comment that basically their English is not good enough, so now you need to try and speak Spanish badly for them.
Right. Like, even if they're native, even if they've lived here their whole lives and they're actually a perfect native speaker of English,
right.
But just because they also speak Spanish or they are from a Hispanic background or whatever, that you're sort of, that you think you have to talk down to them in Spanish or something like that.
Yeah.
It's just a slightly sensitive issue that I am aware exists.
Right.
And I'm not yet well attuned enough to it to be able to feel comfortable judging the situation.
Yeah, I'm sure like in your location, you probably wouldn't want to just go into a bar and just kind of try and strike up a conversation with somebody who you hear is speaking Spanish. I mean, obviously,
right.
Like in your situation, it would be much more sensible to go to, for example, to like a community center or something like that, and say, I want to practice Spanish. Is there some way to arrange like an exchange program, or just where that it's understood that, as you said, that they are doing you a favor by helping you practice your Spanish,
right?
Just so that relationship and that understanding is completely clear from the beginning, and it's clearly for the purposes of language learning,
right?
For your language learning, you'd want to make sure that understanding is firmly in place, I'm sure.
Yeah, so that's something I need to look up. As you say, like a community center or maybe even the local library.
Yeah,
there's probably resources all over the place. Obviously, I'm a child of the 21st century at this point, and I'm used to doing everything on the internet. So actually being able to connect to native speakers from Spain, which is, the Spanish I'm used to, is almost easier because I can just do it from my own home.
Right.
But it would be worthwhile to try and make some connections with the Spanish-speaking community here, because obviously that's much more convenient and much more real as well, actually talking to people face-to-face in real life. So that's something I haven't looked into yet. But
have you thought about, because I know that, and also listeners of the show will also know that you are very experienced and very enthusiastic and very passionate about dancing. Have you thought about that avenue? For example, finding perhaps getting into flamenco or things like that, where there's like more of a likelihood that you're going to find connections where you can say, oh, by the way, I'm really eager to learn some Spanish. Is there a way that or eager to practice Spanish, I should say?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if listeners of Station 13 are aware, because I'm not sure if we've mentioned it.
Oh, really?
But,
maybe we haven't.
Well, whatever. Anyway, yes, I dance Argentine tango. That was a thing that I did in England before I moved to Japan. And then when I moved to Japan, it was a really good way of meeting people and of being able to practice my Japanese, precisely because there was no pressure to continue an awkward conversation.
Yeah.
Like if I was talking and the other person didn't really understand, or if, the conversation was running a bit dry because we were running out of topics that I could express.
You just dance.
Or you could just say, oh, well, shall we dance? Right. And then leave it there, right?
Yeah.
So it was a good way to sort of, it was a good way to be amongst Japanese speakers.
Yeah.
But without feeling like I'm annoying them the whole time with my inability to speak.
Yeah.
Right? So it was a really good way to sort of... Here, I have been a few times to tango in this area. It's much bigger here than it was in Kansai.
Right.
So there's the place that we go, there's, 100 or 200 people there most times. And those people come from all sorts of countries and all sorts of walks of life. Tango is originally a dance from Argentina, obviously. So that's a native Spanish-speaking country.
Right.
So there's definitely potential there, although I wouldn't say that even the majority of the people going are actually from Argentina or a Spanish-speaking country.
No, of course. Yeah, tango, I was thinking less than flamenco, which flamenco, at least to my knowledge, tango to me seems more common and more popular than flamenco. No, is that totally wrong?
I would say, I'm not really sure, but certainly around here, I would think that tango is more popular than flamenco and less popular than salsa.
Right. So
also, tango and salsa are both dances that you do as, in couples, whereas flamenco, more often than not, is more of a solo or a group thing, but less sort of one-on-one, except for like sevillanas and things. But
yeah, I thought of flamenco only because of the connection, obviously, with European Spanish and
right.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll see how it goes. I'm just getting started with this thing, building up the Anki cards to sort of get myself a foundation, and then looking for ways to introduce some actual real practice into my life, which may be a few regular italki sessions, or it may involve finding some community here where I can practice. But
best of luck.
Thank you. Yes, I'll keep you updated.